Well, hello there, and I do hope you're all well. Right, I'll be as brief as I can be. James O'Brien, earlier on this week, he invited a guest onto his show called Peter Foster. Now, does political policy for the Financial Times, if I remember rightly, but also the author of a Brexit Briefing. And he asked him two very interesting and important questions. One was, what do you think is... if he could hypnotise Liz Truss into why she wants to trigger Article 16, what's the thought process for it? And B, did he actually think he would still be writing a Brexit briefing in the year 2022? Very interesting conversation and a must listen. Enjoy.
It is 12:49. You are listening to James O'Brien. I'm fairly confident that the next contributor to the programme won't be compelling me to issue apologies for foul language after I have bid him farewell. I speak of Peter Foster, the public policy editor of the Financial Times and author of their rather splendid Brexit Briefing, which I suppose I shall open before we get stuck into Northern Irish issues, Pete, by asking whether or not back in 2016 you thought you'd still be writing a Brexit Briefing in 2022.
That's a good question, James. I mean, actually, this issue that we're about to talk about, Northern Ireland, was always going to be the issue. If we were going to be talking about any issue 6 years after Brexit, it was always going to be this: how you square the circle in Northern Ireland. Because obviously there was no trade border in Ireland because we were in the single market and we all followed the same rules. When we left that single market, that begged the question, where's the trade border going to go? It couldn't go north-south in Ireland, and it therefore had to go in the Irish Sea, and that's the origin of this continuing row, because the solution that was agreed by the British government is now being reneged upon. It's being rejected by the unionist community. And here we are, as you say, 6 years on, still trying to square the circle.
And threatening to trigger Article 16. And you will know the journalists on the Times who've written this story today as well as I do. So it is copper-bottomed, no doubt. Liz Truss toying quite seriously, or indeed intending to trigger Article 16 and essentially to introduce legislation that would allow us to abandon all of the requirements of the Northern Ireland Protocol. What would that mean, in your opinion?
Well, it's actually, I think there's a distinction here, James, between triggering Article 16 and tabling this legislation.
Yeah, it goes. 16, yeah, sorry, you're right.
Well, no, but I mean, the point being, actually, to answer your question, if you trigger Article 16, that is a dispute resolution mechanism that's within this agreement, the Northern Ireland Protocol. And you have to do the minimum to disrupt the protocol. You have to go into kind of joint resolution where both sides get together and they sit in the committee and they work out, well, what's the problem here? How do we fix it? That's actually not what the British government is saying. The British government is saying, Liz Truss is saying, it's what we reported in the Financial Times 2 weeks ago.
Yes,
we will put in legislation that will allow us to unilaterally switch off this agreement that we agreed with Brussels in 2019 to try and manage this border in the Irish Sea. We're just going to switch it off. So in UK law, we'll no longer apply the checks, we'll no longer follow the state aid rules, we'll no longer follow the basis of the protocol, which was that in order to avoid a border north-south in Ireland, that Northern Ireland would follow the rules of the EU single market for goods. And that, of course, is very difficult for the unionist community, James. You'll remember, in fact, Theresa May said it was a deal that no British Prime Minister could sign, but it was the deal that Boris Johnson signed.
What did they think would happen? And I know that's a bit of a speculation, but you follow things more closely than anybody. What did they think would happen? Because I read people like David Frost sometimes and some of that lot, and it's as if they thought that the European Union were going to sign up to it but not really mean it, or am I misreading their commentary?
Well, I think if you're charitable, you think that they thought that the EU would implement it in a much more light touch way. Right. Although, to be clear, it is being implemented on the basis of what they call the grace period. So it's not, there are not full Dover-Calais style controls in the Irish Sea. So we're operating on about sort of 30, 40, 50% of what a full protocol would be. But, from a European Union perspective, Dominic Cummings, Johnson's former advisor, said that essentially he told Johnson to sign the deal to ignore what Cummings said was the babbling of officials about what it would mean for Northern Ireland, essentially so he could fight an election against Jeremy Corbyn, which they duly, as you know, won with an 8-seat majority. Yeah. So, the least charitable argument, or which you hear in Brussels, I'm afraid, is that Johnson signed it with his fingers crossed behind his back, and they never intended to fully implement it, and they'd always try and relitigate it after the fact. I think what's worrying is that this threat of universal disapplication or switching off the protocol is different from saying, let's have a good old Barney about how you implement it. Let's try and do it in the most de-dramatised, light touch way, bearing in mind that the election we've just seen, the local election, assembly election, 60% of the MLAs, the Legislative Assembly in Stormont, is in favour of retaining the protocol. Some of them want tweaks to it.
And so is the population of Northern Ireland, according to all of the polling. And so the political calculation... I mean, my callers have offered up suggestions on what the political calculation is. It's a somewhat desperate attempt to remove from the table evidence that membership of the single market is preferable to non-membership. What do you think motivates Liz Truss?
I regret to say, I think the briefing is incredibly unfortunate ahead of the Queen's speech, because it's really about positioning yourself, looking tough on the protocol, looking tough on Northern Ireland. But any solution, if you go back to the Good Friday Agreement, any solution in Northern Ireland, James, requires both sides to be upset. That's almost the nature of the beast here.
Yes.
And so unilaterally disapplying a protocol, what we need is a middle ground, a risk-based approach that runs that border in a way that causes the least dislocation for the unionist community in Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland business also get the best of both worlds. Don't forget that. It cuts both ways. But this is not going to settle down by the UK threatening to tear up the agreement and walk away, because, as we just said, 60% of the MLAs are in favour, if you had the alliance vote, the SDLP, Sinn Féin, of making the protocol work. So, you've got to find a middle ground here. And
what does it look like?
Well, it looks like taking that trade border, which needs to be there in order to avoid the border north-south, which all sides agree mustn't be there, and implementing it in a way that is acceptable. But one of the problems here, James, is that if you're a unionist and you've campaigned on this dreadful protocol being the end of the world, even though the economics don't suggest, by the way, it is the end of the world, and the British government has said it's the most dreadful and awful thing. If you're a unionist politician, how do you sell the compromise? The space for compromise has been consistently shut down by a British government that's determined to decry how dreadful the protocol is, rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of how do we implement it in a way that is minimum impact for business and for businesses and the community.
So it would be something along the lines of a relatively small amount of product would be affected. That's what a compromise would look like.
I think that's what the business community would like. They'd like the Commission, the European Union, to be more flexible.
And it is a unique situation, so it's not as if European Union countries that have borders with non-European Union countries would throw their arms up in despair and say, why do they get special treatment? It is unique in that sense. It's not precedent setting, is it?
No,
so there could be room for something like a compromise.
I think that's right. And the EU would say, look, we put a load of compromises forward in October. The UK have said, those are not enough. But I think, the European Union put forward a work programme in February, and the British government basically rejected it and said, we can't talk on the basis of what you've offered. We need Maroš Šefčovič, who's the EU negotiator, to have a whole new mandate. I don't think that's going to happen, James. I think we've got to try and walk this back into the kind of technical, boring space that doesn't get on talk radios. But I don't know how you do that, given how political this has become.
Well, I mean, and it of course it always has been. And when you refer to talk radio in that way, you mean that it is dull, it is technical, and it is... that's the point, isn't it? In a binary universe, stuff that is actually going to be disappointing to both sides is almost inconceivable in Brexit Britain. It's all about... Well, what is it all about? The final question, I promise, because I know you've got a lot on. But Liz Truss, if I hypnotised Liz Truss and said, why are you doing this now, what would she say?
I think she would say, I'm defending the Good Friday Agreement, which has been rendered inoperable by a protocol because the unionist parties won't go into power sharing until the protocol is fixed.
Right.
And I'm defending the internal market of the UK, which is a posh way of saying making it as easy to move bangers from Birmingham to Belfast as it is from Birmingham to Brighton. Right? Yeah. That's what she'd say. And I would say, you're making it an either-or choice, and we need to get back into the middle ground.
And that's where the fingers crossed come in, because this was always going to happen. And Boris Johnson must have understood that it was always going to happen, but Dominic Cummings was more interested in winning the election than the future of the country, and Boris Johnson was pretty much doing whatever he was told to do by the person he thought would deliver him an election victory.
Your words, not mine, James.
No, I know.
But, I know, but I think. Listen. One of the problems here is trust. So that point of view, like that you've just enunciated, is widely held in EU capitals and in Europe. So
which we never see over here unless we're lucky enough to read the Financial Times every morning.
But there's a massive trust deficit, right, where a lot of these solutions require both sides to believe that they're implementing the deal they signed in good faith, not standing there threatening to rip it up. It's quite a difficult environment in order to get a middle ground.
Well, and it's never ending, because if they come to some new compromise, it's against the backdrop of knowing that the people you're coming to a compromise with 1 month down the line might be threatening to tear up the last thing they compromised on, in the same way that they've threatened to tear up the original treaty before before the ink was dry on it.
Well, no, indeed. And so in my conversations in Brussels, when you ask, well, are you going to make a move? Are you going to try and... Because the DUP do need to get into power.
Of course they do.
You pay a big price in Northern Ireland. We've seen it with this rise of this alliance vote, this centrist party. If you don't get into the executive and start sorting out the NHS waiting lists and all the rest of it, you pay a price. So actually the DUP arguably need to get this sorted, because they need to get into government to resurrect their political fortune.
Otherwise they risk redundancy.
No, indeed. But when you talk to people in Brussels and say, look, are you going to make a big move? Can you make an offer? They say, well, this just feels like arm twisting by the British government. And you've got Sinn Féin saying, don't make Northern Ireland a pawn in the game, between the British government. I nearly swore then, actually.
Right, funny that, given that I've just issued a very, as Pete would have heard, a very rare apology for a previous contribution from our friend in Northern Ireland. Pete, thank you.
Well, the reason why I enjoyed listening to that and found it fascinating, because unlike Michael Gove, I still like listening to experts, not clowns like Nigel Foghorn of Ignorance or that prize plum Lee Anderson, and certainly not Michael Gove, that blind, shifty turd that he is. So his answers were absolutely... I particularly enjoyed what he thought Liz Truss would say for the reason why she's wanting to trigger Article 16. I thought it was a really, really interesting way of looking at it. She said a lot of things, like she said she doesn't want to vote for something that would mean her children losing their freedom of movement, but that soon went down the bin, didn't it? But anyway, I do hope you enjoy the video, and also have a wonderful weekend. Until the next time, I shall bid you farewell and take care.